"Don't touch the patient unless your hands are steady," Mara said, her voice calm as the storm rattled the windows of the mountain infirmary. The fire in the hearth had almost burned down to embers, and the room smelled faintly of pine, chamomile, and rain-soaked wool. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a low warning, but inside, Mara was focused only on the man lying on her bed, pale and silent, with a fevered sheen across his brow. His coat had been left near the door, heavy with mud from the forest road. He looked like any other traveler who had pushed himself too far and arrived at her clinic on the edge of exhaustion. She had seen plenty of them in the last 3 winters: miners, hunters, merchants, lost souls with empty eyes and too much pride to admit they needed help. This one was different only in one way. He had not spoken since she found him collapsed by the roadside just after sunset. Now, as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, his lashes fluttered once, then settled again. "Easy," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You're safe here." The infirmary was nothing grand. Just 2 rooms, 1 narrow cot, shelves of bottles, and a chipped wooden table where she mixed remedies by hand. But it was warm, and it was hers, built slowly from patience and long nights and the quiet belief that every person deserved care, no matter how they arrived at her door. A weak man, a rich man, a proud man, a stranger in a torn coat. Mara treated them all the same. That was how she had survived. That was how she had learned not to ask questions too quickly. The man on her bed shifted slightly, the movement small but tense, like a guard dog waking in the dark. Mara noticed, of course. She noticed everything. The way his hand twitched near his side. The strange weight of his ring, dark metal half hidden beneath his sleeve. The unusual warmth rising from his skin, not the brittle heat of a common fever, but something deeper, something steady and strange. She adjusted the blanket over his chest and reached for the basin beside her. "You must have been walking for hours," she said softly. "Maybe longer." No answer. Only the faint rise and fall of his breathing. A gust of wind struck the side of the cabin, and the candle flame leaned hard to one side. Mara glanced toward the window, where the glass had gone silver with rain. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled over the ridge. She turned back just in time to see the stranger's eyes open. They were not ordinary eyes. Even in the dim light, they caught the fire like polished amber, sharp and alert despite the weakness in his face. For one breath, he stared at her as if measuring the shape of her soul. Then his gaze dropped to the cloth in her hands, to the medicine on the table, to the simple white apron tied around her waist. Mara did not flinch. She only lifted her chin a little and said, "If you're awake enough to glare at me, you're awake enough to drink this." A flicker, almost amusement, touched his expression before it vanished. He tried to sit up, failed, and let out the faintest exhale of frustration. Mara steadied him with one hand on his shoulder, firm but unafraid. "Stay still," she told him. "You came here injured. That makes you my responsibility until morning." The stranger's gaze stayed on her, unblinking, as if no one had spoken to him like that in a very long time. Then, with visible effort, he obeyed. And as Mara lifted the spoon to his lips, she had no idea that the quiet man in her care was not a traveler at all, but the emperor of the realm, hidden beneath borrowed silence and a mortal-looking wound. The storm had not eased by morning. It pressed against the mountain infirmary in long, restless breaths, rattling the shutters and turning the windows silver with rain. Mara had already rebuilt the fire, replaced the soaked bandages, and set a fresh basin of warm water beside the bed. The stranger was awake again, though still too still for someone who had nearly collapsed at her door the night before. He sat propped against the pillows, one hand resting over the blanket as if he did not quite trust his own body yet. Mara moved quietly around the room, grinding herbs with a mortar, checking the kettle, glancing once at the color in his face and deciding it was improved, if only a little. She did not ask his name. Men who came down from the northern roads often carried names they were not ready to share, and she had learned that silence was sometimes the safest kindness. When she set the cup near him, he watched her with that same unnerving attention, as if every small movement mattered. "You did not sleep," he said at last, his voice low and rough from disuse. Mara snorted softly, tucking a loose braid behind her ear. "And let you wake up alone? That would be rude." Something in his expression shifted at that, the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth, gone before it could fully become a smile. He reached for the cup, then paused when his fingers brushed the porcelain. His hand was steady enough now, but there was still a tension in him, as if every simple action cost more than he wanted to admit. Mara noticed everything. She noticed the way he sat as though he had once been trained to hold a throne, the way his shoulders stayed squared even while he was injured, the way he listened to sounds outside the room as if he expected trouble to arrive on the wind. Still, she said nothing. She only checked the herbal poultice on his side and adjusted the blanket over his knees. "You are colder than you should be," she murmured. "Drink this slowly." His eyes lowered to her hands again, and for a moment the room felt smaller, quieter, as if the rain itself had leaned closer to listen. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. Mara tied the ribbon of her apron with one quick motion and met his gaze without hesitation. "Should I be?" He was silent for a beat too long. Then, very softly, he said, "Most people would be." The honesty in his voice made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect. Most people, she thought, had probably never looked at him twice. Or perhaps they had looked too much and still seen nothing real. She set the mortar down and reached for the cloth again, careful and unhurried. "Most people are not the ones I am trying to heal," she said. That earned her a longer pause, a deeper study from those dark, unreadable eyes. Outside, the mountain wind slipped around the eaves and carried the scent of wet stone through the cracks. Inside, the fire cracked once, bright and brief. He watched her as if he had never encountered a person who treated him like a man instead of a mystery. Mara dipped the cloth into the warm water and gently cleaned the edge of the wound hidden beneath the folds of his shirt. He inhaled sharply, not from pain but from surprise, and she looked up at once. "Too much?" she asked. He shook his head once. The motion was controlled, but she caught the slight tremor in his hand when it curled against the blanket. "No," he said. "You are simply the first person who has asked." Mara did not answer right away. The words settled between them with a quiet weight, soft as falling snow and just as cold. Her heart pinched, not from pity, but from the terrible understanding that some people survived by becoming unreachable. So she gave him what she always gave her patients: steady hands, a calm voice, and no demand for anything he was not ready to offer. When she finished, she straightened and lifted the basin to carry it away. He spoke before she reached the door. "Wait." Mara turned. He was looking at her with an intensity that made the lantern flame seem dim by comparison. "What is your name?" he asked. For a moment, she simply stood there with the basin balanced in both hands, the storm murmuring behind the walls, and the injured man waiting for an answer that mattered more than it should have. Then she said, "Mara." The silence that followed was strange, almost reverent. He repeated it once, as though testing the sound of it. "Mara." And something in the way he said her name made her fingers tighten around the basin handle, though she could not have said why. She only knew that when he looked at her like that, it felt less like being observed and more like being recognized. Not by the stranger in her bed, she told herself, but by the weary man behind the wound. She did not know that, in the capital far below the mountain, servants were bowing in fear at the very mention of an emperor who had vanished 3 nights ago. She did not know that the quiet guest by her fire had left behind a palace, a council, and a kingdom holding its breath. And she certainly did not know that the way he had just said her name would be the first thread in a fate neither of them could outrun. By the 3rd day, the mountain no longer felt like a place caught in a storm, but like a pocket of silence the world had forgotten. Snowmelt slid in thin streams along the stone path outside the infirmary, and the pines stood dark and motionless beneath a pale winter sky. Inside, the air was warm with pinewood smoke and the clean scent of herbs crushed between Mara's fingers. She moved through the small room with practiced care, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair tied back to keep it from the tray she carried. The stranger watched her in that quiet, unsettling way of his, as if he noticed everything and nothing at the same time. Mara had learned that he did not ask for much. He did not complain when the pain woke him in the night. He did not call for attention when his breathing grew shallow. He only looked toward the window now and then, toward the long, white sweep of the mountains beyond the glass, with an expression so distant it made her wonder what kind of life he had been pulled from before he arrived at her door. "You should not be sitting up yet," Mara said as she set the fresh cloth on the table beside him. And you should not keep treating me like I am made of glass. His voice was still rough, but there was a faint warmth in it now, something more human than the first night. Mara lowered her gaze to hide the way that answer unsettled her. You nearly fell unconscious in my doorway, she said. That is not a fair argument in your favor. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved, almost into a smile. It was small, brief, and strangely disarming. Mara pretended not to notice. She lifted the basin, checked the bandage wrapped beneath his collar, and tried not to think about the fact that his pulse had steadied in her care. It was an ordinary thing, she told herself. She was a healer. This was what she did. She fed the feverish. She cleaned wounds. She listened when people had no one else to listen. That was all. And yet, when she touched the edge of the dressing to make sure it held, he went still beneath her hand. Not tense, not afraid, just still, as if her touch had reached somewhere deeper than the skin. Mara felt it too, a small shift in the air, quiet and electric, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. She drew back at once. Does that hurt? She asked. He looked at her fingers, then at her face. No, he said after a moment. It does not hurt. The answer should have relaxed her. Instead, it left something taut inside her chest, as though his silence carried more weight than his words. She busied herself with the tea on the hearth, pouring hot water over dried chamomile and mountain mint until the room filled with a soft, calming steam. When she returned, he was staring at the wooden shelf by the wall, where her few books stood lined in careful order beside jars of dried flowers and labeled remedies. One of the books had been repaired with twine, its spine cracked from years of use. You read often, he said. When there is time. And when there is no time, then I read faster. That earned another faint pull of his mouth, and Mara caught herself looking at it too long. She set the cup in his hands and stepped back, but he did not drink at once. He held the warm clay between both palms as if he were measuring its heat, or perhaps the kindness in it. You do not ask many questions, he said quietly. Mara glanced at him. Should I? Most people would have begun with my name. The words landed softly, but they changed the room. Mara had no answer for that. She only thought of the way he had looked at her when he said her name yesterday, as if it mattered. You never offered it, she said at last. Then perhaps I have been waiting for the right moment. There was something in his tone then, low and careful, that made her lift her head. For one suspended second, she felt as though she were standing at the edge of something vast, something that had been waiting longer than she could understand. Before she could ask what he meant, a sharp sound broke the stillness outside. Hooves. Voices. The crunch of boots in the snow. Mara turned first, her heart giving a hard, wary beat as she crossed to the window. Down the narrow mountain road, riders were climbing toward the infirmary, their cloaks snapping in the wind, their saddles marked with the crest of the capital. She went cold all at once. The stranger had already noticed. He was not alarmed, but the change in him was immediate, like the moment before a blade is drawn, all stillness and contained force. His gaze moved to the window, then back to her. Who are they? Mara asked. He did not answer right away. Outside, the riders drew nearer, their presence pressing against the walls like an approaching tide. Then he spoke, and his voice had lost none of its quiet, but something in it had deepened into authority. People I did not expect to find so soon, he said. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she saw that the calm man in her bed was not only tired or guarded. He was bracing himself, as though he had spent years carrying a burden no one else could see. The knock came an instant later, heavy and formal, echoing through the small infirmary like the opening of a door that could never be closed again. Mara's fingers tightened around the windowsill. The stranger stood slowly, and though he moved with visible care, there was nothing weak in the rise of his shoulders, nothing ordinary in the way the room seemed to shift around him. When the knock came again, he met her eyes, and in that look was a warning she did not yet understand, and a trust that startled her more than fear ever could. Mara, he said, and her name sounded different now, no longer gentle, but weighty, as if it belonged to a moment that would change both of their lives. Before she could answer, he added, Do not open the door until I tell you to. The knock came again, heavy and measured, and Mara felt the sound in her ribs before it reached her ears. The stranger did not move at once. He only stood there beside the fire, one hand braced lightly against the table, his expression unreadable in the shifting amber light. For a moment, the mountain infirmary seemed to hold its breath around him. Mara crossed the room in 2 quiet steps and reached for the latch, but his voice stopped her without force, low and steady in the darkened hush. "Wait." She looked back. He was still calm, but something had sharpened in his face, a warning drawn tight beneath the surface. Another knock landed against the door, and this one carried authority, the kind that expected the world to open for it. Mara could hear voices beyond the wood, muffled by the storm and the thick walls. Men, at least 2. One spoke first, clipped and impatient, asking whether the traveler inside was awake. The other said nothing, but she could hear the shift of armor and the faint creak of boots on wet stone. The stranger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He met Mara's eyes, and in that glance she saw a request he did not bother to explain. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper. A need for her to trust him without being told why. So she lowered her hand from the latch and stepped back from the door. The room felt smaller for it. The warm air suddenly too thin, the fire too bright. Outside, the wind dragged itself over the roof in long, cold fingers. Then the visitor spoke again, louder this time. "We were told the healer here took in a man after the storm," he said. "Open the door." Mara kept still. She had spent years tending broken bones, fevers, cuts, and coughs in this isolated place, but no one had ever spoken to her door as though it belonged to them. Before she could decide what to say, the stranger in her care moved with quiet precision. He took the blanket from his shoulders and draped it over the chair, then sat down on the edge of the bed as if he had all the time in the world. But Mara saw the effort in that motion, the careful restraint, the way he guarded himself even while pretending at ease. "If they see me standing," he murmured, "they will know." "Know what?" she whispered. He looked at her then, and for the first time there was something almost fragile in his calm. "That I am not what I seem." The words settled between them like snow. Mara did not know how to answer that, because she already knew enough to understand that people with secrets did not arrive at mountain infirmaries by accident. Another voice barked from the far side of the door, this one colder than the first. "We have orders." "Orders." The words slipped through the room like ice. Mara had heard enough of the realm to understand that orders came from people with power, and power did not climb this far into the mountains for nothing. She felt her pulse quicken, but the stranger only closed his eyes for one brief second, as if collecting himself. When he opened them again, there was resolve there, quiet and immense. "Mara," he said softly, "if they ask, you found no one here but a patient recovering from fever." She stared at him. He was asking her to lie, yet his voice was so calm, so certain, that it did not feel like a demand. It felt like an invitation into danger. Before she could decide whether to obey, the door handle turned. Mara moved without thinking. She stepped in front of the bed, hands empty and raised just enough to show she meant no harm. The latch rattled once, twice, and then stopped. A hard silence followed. Through the door, a man said, "There is someone inside." Mara swallowed, feeling the stranger's presence behind her like heat. Then, in the narrow space between one breath and the next, she heard the faintest sound from the bed. Not a word, not a plea, just the soft shift of fabric, and a quietness so controlled it made the whole room feel poised on the edge of something she could not yet name. When the voices outside grew sharper, the stranger spoke at last, and though his tone was still even, it carried a weight that made Mara's spine straighten. "Stand where you are," he said, not to her, but to the men outside. For a single beat, there was only silence. Then the voices beyond the door changed. Not in volume, but in shape. Respect entered them, sudden and unmistakable, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Mara did not understand why. She only knew that the air had shifted, and the man behind her was no longer merely a wounded stranger in need of shelter. He was something far more dangerous to recognize. And just as the latch began to lift from the other side, he said her name again, quietly, as if anchoring her to the only safe place left in the room. "Mara." The silence after his name should have comforted Mara, but it did not. It only made the room feel smaller, as if the mountain itself had leaned closer to listen. The stranger stood near the fire, one hand resting against the table, his shoulders too still, his breathing too measured. Even injured, He carried himself like someone who had spent years being obeyed. Mara noticed it now in the way he watched the door, not with fear, but with patience. With control. The knock outside came again, softer this time, and then a voice spoke through the wood, careful and deferential. "We are searching for someone who may have taken shelter here," the man said. "A traveler of importance. If he is inside, we are instructed to bring him home at once." Mara's stomach tightened. She glanced at the stranger, expecting surprise or anger, or at least some visible reaction. Instead, his gaze stayed on the door, calm and unreadable. "Home," he repeated quietly, as if the word belonged to another life. Mara stepped forward before she could stop herself. "He is a patient," she said, her voice steady despite the pulse beating hard beneath her ribs. "And he will not be moved until he is well enough." There was a pause outside. Then, to her surprise, the answer came not with argument, but with restraint. "You do not understand who you are protecting." Mara almost smiled at that, though there was no humor in it. "I understand that he is tired, injured, and under my care." The stranger lowered his eyes for a brief moment, and something in his expression shifted, not toward weakness, but toward quiet gratitude so deep it nearly unsettled her. The storm pressed harder against the windows. The fire gave a low crackle. Outside, boots shifted in the snow, then stopped. The man at the door spoke again, his tone lowered. "If he remains hidden much longer, the council will consider it an insult." Mara felt the weight of those words, even if she did not yet know why they mattered. She only knew that the room seemed to change around the stranger whenever his identity was threatened, as if the air itself refused to name him. He finally looked at her, and in his eyes there was something she had not seen before, a warning wrapped in kindness. "If they ask," he said softly, "tell them nothing." Mara held his gaze. "Are you asking me to lie?" A faint pause followed, and then the smallest hint of a smile touched his mouth. "I am asking you to choose who you trust." The words landed gently, but they stayed with her like a bell tone in an empty hall. Before she could answer, the door latch shifted from the outside, and the room went utterly still. The latch lifted a fraction, and Mara's breath caught so sharply it hurt. The room held itself still around her, every sound sharpened by the storm outside. The stranger did not move toward the door. He only turned his head slightly, listening, as if he could measure the shape of the danger by the rhythm of footsteps alone. Then the voice outside came again, calmer now, almost polite. "The envoy will not wait all night." Mara swallowed. The man by the fire lowered his gaze for a moment, and when he looked back at her, the tiredness in his face seemed older than the mountain itself. "They are not here for medicine," he said. Mara's fingers tightened around the cloth in her hands. She had already sensed as much, but hearing it spoken aloud made the room feel colder. "Then why are they here?" she asked. His answer took a beat too long. It was not hesitation exactly. It was restraint. "Because some people," he said quietly, "cannot bear to lose what they believe belongs to them." Another knock sounded, softer this time, but the meaning behind it was no less urgent. Mara glanced toward the door, then back at him. "And do you belong to them?" The question seemed to land deeper than she intended. For the first time since she had met him, something unreadable crossed his face. Not fear, not anger, just a long, distant stillness, like a sky holding back thunder. "No," he said at last. "But they will act as if I do." Mara stared at him, trying to understand the shape of that answer. But before she could ask more, he reached for the blanket folded at the edge of the table. His movements were careful, measured, yet even in pain he moved with a kind of natural authority that made the room feel smaller around him. "Listen to me," he said, and there was no softness left in his voice now, only a quiet command that made her shoulders straighten without meaning to. "When they enter, do not let them see hesitation. Do not let them see fear." Mara almost laughed at that, because fear was already standing in the room with them, breathing through the cracks in the window. Still, she nodded once. "I am not afraid of them," she lied. He looked at her then, and she knew he understood the lie immediately. Instead of calling her on it, he said, "Good. Then keep your hands steady." Before she could respond, another sound came from outside, not a knock this time, but the scrape of boots across packed snow, followed by the low murmur of several voices. The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Too many," he murmured. Mara moved before she had time to think. slipping the medicine tray into place and setting the room in order with quick, practiced hands. It gave her something to do. It gave her a shape to hold on to. The door opened without warning. Cold air rushed in, carrying snow, polished leather, and the sharp, formal scent of authority. 3 men stood in the doorway, cloaks dusted white, their expressions severe beneath the hooded shadow of the storm. The one in front took in the room in a single glance, his eyes passing over Mara as if she were part of the furniture. "We were told there was a guest here," he said. Mara kept her face calm, even as her pulse hammered in her throat. "You were told correctly," she replied. The man's gaze shifted to the figure near the fire. And him. Mara felt the silence widen. The stranger did not speak at once. When he finally did, his voice was level, almost mild. "A patient." The envoy's mouth tightened faintly. "A patient does not hide from the council." Mara's stomach turned. "Council." The word carried weight she did not yet understand, but she could feel its shape pressing against the edges of the room. The stranger gave no sign of surprise. He only met the envoy's stare with a calm so complete it was almost unsettling. "Then perhaps," he said, "the council has mistaken a healer's house for a throne room." The envoy stiffened. Mara saw it happen in the small tightening around his jaw, the way his hand shifted once near his side. No one in the room moved. The fire cracked softly between them. The storm leaned in. And in that unbearable silence, Mara realized she was standing between 2 worlds she had never meant to join. One of them believed they were owed obedience. The other had not yet decided whether to show his power. The envoy drew a slow breath. "You will come with us," he said at last. The stranger looked at Mara, not the men at the door, not the storm beyond them, only Mara. In that look was a question, and a warning, and something far more dangerous than either. "Trust me," it seemed to say without words, "or be changed by what happens next." Mara's heart thudded once, hard and clear. Then she lifted her chin and faced the envoy without looking away. "He is under my care," she said, "and he is not going anywhere until I say he is well enough." For one stunned second, the room went so still it felt suspended in breath. Then the stranger's gaze softened almost imperceptibly, and though he said nothing, something in the room shifted around that silence, as if the mountain itself had just chosen a side. The envoy's footsteps had barely faded before the stranger exhaled, slow and controlled, as if he had been holding himself together for far longer than the storm had lasted. Mara kept her hands at her sides, though her fingers still trembled from the weight of the choice she had just made. The room smelled of wet wood, herbs, and the faint heat of the fire sinking low in the hearth. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the shutters in long, restless breaths, but inside, a fragile kind of quiet settled between them. The man near her fire sat straighter now, no longer a shadow drawn thin by pain. He watched the door for a moment, then turned his attention back to her, and in the dim light his eyes looked older than before, as if the night had peeled back one more layer of whatever guarded him. "You should not have done that," he said softly. Mara let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. "You were not in a condition to argue." For the first time, something like amusement touched his face, brief and tired, but real. It made him look less like a figure carved from danger and more like a man forced to remember he was still alive. Mara crossed to the side table and reached for the basin of cool water she had prepared earlier. "Hold still," she murmured. He lifted a brow. That sounded like an order. It was. She dipped the cloth and wrung it out, then stepped closer and carefully cleaned the dark soot and dried rain from the edge of his jaw. His skin was warm beneath her touch, not feverish, but carrying a heat that seemed to live somewhere deeper than flesh. He did not move away. If anything, he seemed to still even more, as if he trusted the simple rhythm of her hands more than he trusted words. Mara noticed then how tense he had been since the envoy arrived, how every muscle in him had prepared for a different kind of ending. Not fear exactly, more like the memory of being treated as something to own, something to summon, something to use. She did not know where the thought came from, only that it settled into her chest with a quiet ache. "They knew you," she said before she could stop herself. His gaze flicked to hers, sharp for a moment. "Who?" "The men at the door. They looked at you like they were afraid of forgetting your face." He said nothing at first. The fire popped softly between them. Then he looked down at the cloth in her hand and answered, That is because some people remember power only when it stands in front of them. Mara studied him, unsettled by the calm in his voice. It was not pride. It was something colder and older, a truth worn smooth by years of being obeyed or opposed. She set the cloth back into the basin, then folded her arms lightly against herself. "And what are you?" she asked, not with accusation, but with the honest caution of someone standing at the edge of a door she had not meant to open. His expression changed so subtly that she might have missed it if she had not been watching. Not anger, not offense. Recognition, perhaps, or regret. "That," he said, "depends on who is asking." Mara should have stepped back. Instead, she felt herself drawn closer to the strange gravity of his calm. There was a presence around him, quiet and immense, like a mountain hidden behind the fog. He looked at the basin, then at her hands, then finally into her face with a steadiness that made her pulse catch. "You did not ask for my name," he said. "You did not ask what I was worth." "I asked if you were hurt," Mara replied. The corner of his mouth moved again, faint and thoughtful. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what you asked." The room fell still around them. Even the storm seemed to ease for a heartbeat, as if listening. Mara did not know why those words touched her so deeply, only that they did. She had spent too much of her life around people who asked the wrong questions first, the cruel ones, the useful ones, the ones that measured a person before they ever bothered to see them. This man had not, and perhaps that was why she could not make herself step away. A knock sounded again at the outer door, lighter this time, but unmistakable. Mara froze. So did he. But this time, when the knock came, he did not turn toward it. He turned toward her. And in that quiet look, she understood that whatever waited beyond the threshold was not the only thing threatening to change the shape of this night. The knock came a third time, and this one was not for the door. It was a sharp, familiar rhythm in the air, the kind that carried authority even before anyone spoke. Mara felt it at once, the way the room tightened, the way the stranger beside her went still in a manner that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with control. He did not move toward the window. He did not reach for the door. He only lifted his eyes, and the calm in them was so complete it unsettled her more than panic ever could. Outside, the wind moved through the mountain pass in long white breaths, brushing the shutters with a sound like distant wings. Then a voice called from beyond the threshold, careful and formal. "My lord, the household healer has arrived." Mara's pulse stumbled. The stranger's gaze shifted to her for one brief moment, and in that look she saw a warning and something gentler beneath it, something that seemed almost like trust. "Stay here," he said quietly. It was not an order. It was a plea wrapped in restraint. Before she could answer, the latch on the outer door lifted again, and this time the movement was followed by a pause so deep it made the whole room feel suspended. Mara heard the faint scrape of boots, the rustle of heavy cloth, and then the measured entrance of someone who knew exactly how much power to bring into a room. A woman stepped inside carrying a leather satchel and a small lamp shielded by her hand. Her eyes went first to the bed, then to the stranger, then to Mara standing near the basin with her sleeves rolled and her expression carefully blank. For one tense heartbeat, no one spoke. The healer's face changed only slightly, but Mara caught it anyway, the brief flicker of recognition that did not belong to her. "You are awake sooner than expected," the woman said at last, voice low and respectful. The stranger gave a faint nod. The storm ended sooner than expected. Mara almost smiled at that, though she did not know why. The healer moved deeper into the room and set her satchel on the table. She glanced at the bandages Mara had tied, at the herbs crushed by the bedside, at the bowl of water that had already cooled. "These were done well," she said, and there was surprise in her tone, as if she had not expected competence from the young woman beside the bed. Mara lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of how plain her dress was, how unremarkable her hands were, how often the world had taught people to overlook both. "I only did what was needed," she said. The stranger watched her, as if those words mattered more than she knew. The healer stepped closer to inspect the wound, and her expression tightened with professional concern. "You should have remained still," she told him. "You lost more strength than you should have." "I am aware," he replied. There was a dry edge to his voice now, brief and controlled, but it did not lessen the quiet gravity in the room. The healer's gaze flicked once toward Mara. "And you let her treat you?" she asked him. He turned his head slightly, just enough for Mara to see the corner of his mouth settle into something almost like a shadow of a smile. She asked if I was hurt, he said. That was enough. The healer said nothing for a moment. Then she looked at Mara again, this time more carefully, as though reassessing her from the beginning. Mara felt the weight of that look and hated how quickly it made her want to step back. She had spent her whole life being measured by glances like this, by people deciding whether she belonged in the room before she had spoken a single word. But the stranger did not let the silence turn cold. What news from the capital? He asked. The healer's posture changed at once. Whatever she had been about to say disappeared behind caution. The roads are watched, she said. Not by your people. The air seemed to thin. Mara saw the slight shift in the stranger's shoulders, the nearly invisible tightening that came and went too quickly for anyone else to notice. And the council? He asked. Still divided, the healer answered. But your name has not stayed hidden long enough. Someone knows you are here. Mara did not understand the weight of all of it, only that it was enormous. Capital, council, watched roads, hidden name. The words layered over one another like closing doors. She looked from the healer to the stranger and felt suddenly, sharply, that she had stepped much farther into a story than she had intended. Who is he? She asked before she could stop herself. The healer went very still. The stranger did not answer at once. He looked toward the dark window, where the mountain night pressed close against the glass, and when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was quieter now, but it carried something deeper than weariness. Someone who should not have reached this house alive, he said. Mara's breath caught. The healer bowed her head, not in respect to him alone, but to the truth she had just been forced to carry into the room. Then, very carefully, she drew a folded cloth from her satchel and placed it on the table. If your condition worsens, she said, you must not remain here. The stranger's eyes remained on Mara. I know, he said. The room held that silence again, heavy and living. Mara could feel it shaping her choices before she made them. She did not yet know what he truly was, or why the healer looked at him as if she had delivered a message into the heart of a palace instead of a mountain cabin. But she knew one thing with startling certainty. Whatever had come to the door tonight was only the beginning, and somehow, she was already inside it. By dawn, the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like the quiet center of a storm that had finally remembered its name. Mara stood by the window with her hands wrapped around a cup she had not drunk from, watching pale light settle over the mountain trail. The stranger was awake now, seated near the hearth with a blanket across his shoulders and a stillness about him that made the air seem arranged around his breath. He had not asked for anything. He had not demanded anything. Yet the room seemed to keep turning toward him, as if even the fire recognized something old in his presence. Mara lowered her gaze to the herbs on the table, sorting them with careful fingers to keep from thinking about the way the messenger had bowed. She had seen fear before. She had seen pride. She had seen both break in the same face. But last night, in that single room, she had seen something else entirely. Not fear. Not pride. Recognition. A knock sounded at the door again, softer this time, but Mara still tensed. The stranger lifted his eyes toward her first, as though asking without words whether she wished to answer it. That simple gesture unsettled her more than any command would have. She crossed the room, unlatched the door, and found not an enemy, but a pair of imperial attendants standing in the cold, their cloaks dusted with frost, their expressions fixed and careful. One of them lowered his head immediately. We came for His Majesty, he said. Mara went still. The cup in her hands nearly slipped. His Majesty. The words should have made no sense in this small cabin, on this narrow mountain edge, where the walls were patched with old timber and the medicine shelf leaned slightly to the left. But the stranger behind her had already risen. Slowly, not with alarm, with the calm, measured grace of someone who had spent his life being obeyed. Mara turned. For a moment, she could not breathe. The shape of him had changed without changing at all. It was in the way the room held itself, in the way the attendants would not look directly at his face, in the way the mountain silence seemed to bow around him. He looked at Mara, and there was no smugness in his expression, no cruelty, no hidden amusement. Only a quiet truth she had not yet found the courage to name. I did not tell you, he said gently, because I wanted to know whether you would still treat me with kindness if you thought I was no one important. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. then return all at once, hot and stunned. Every memory from the night before rose up inside her. The torn sleeve she had stitched, the fever she had cooled, the way he had washed her hands as though they carried some kind of answer. She had spoken to him like a patient. She had scolded him for moving too soon. She had told him to drink the tea before it went cold. And he had listened. Not because he had to, because he had chosen to. "You let me speak to you like that," she whispered. His mouth softened, almost a smile. "Yes." The attendants remained frozen at the doorway, as if they too understood that this moment belonged only to her. Mara looked at the broad line of his shoulders, the calm in his eyes, the impossible dignity that had never once asked to be noticed, and something in her chest gave way. Not fear, not shame, just wonder, sharp and bright enough to hurt. "You are the Emperor," she said, and her own voice sounded distant to her ears. He inclined his head once. "And you are the woman who saved me when no one else would come near." The fire crackled softly behind them. Outside, the wind moved over the mountain pines, carrying the scent of snow and stone and a world she had never been allowed to enter. Mara looked down at her hands, at the same hands that had wrapped his wound, checked his pulse, and offered him tea as if he were only a traveler in need of shelter. Now those hands seemed suddenly small, ordinary, yet he was still looking at them as though they mattered more than any crown. One of the attendants stepped forward with visible care. "Your carriage is waiting, Your Majesty." The Emperor did not move. His gaze remained on Mara, steady and unhurried, as if the answer he wanted could not be rushed by titles or schedules or the weight of a kingdom. "Come with me," he said at last. It was not an order. It was an invitation so quiet it almost felt sacred. Mara's breath caught. The cabin around her seemed to narrow and expand at once, the past few days folding into a single luminous point. All the time she had been ignored. All the time she had been called insignificant. All the moments she had lowered her eyes and kept walking. They were still there, but they no longer held the shape of the ending. The Emperor reached out, palm open, waiting. Not taking. Waiting. And in that waiting, Mara understood the truth that had been moving toward her since the first knock in the dark. Dignity had never belonged to the people who spoke the loudest. It belonged to the soul that remained gentle when it had every reason not to be. Slowly, with the mountain light washing over her like blessing, she placed her hand in his. The path down the mountain was silent except for the soft brush of Mara's boots against frost and stone. She kept her fingers curled around the warm edge of the Emperor's sleeve when the trail grew steep, not because she needed to hold on, but because letting go somehow felt impossible. Beside her, he walked with the same quiet steadiness he had carried in the cabin, his presence no longer hidden by shadows, though still softened by restraint. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain, and every breath felt like stepping out of one life and into another. Mara did not look at the people waiting below until they came into view. The servants at the outer gate froze first, then the guards. Then the whole courtyard seemed to turn its face toward her, as if the mountain itself had sent back something they had never expected to see again. Whispers rippled through the crowd, quick as wind through dry grass. She recognized the shape of disbelief before she heard the words. A healer from the valley. A girl from nowhere. The woman they had once sent away with tired eyes and dismissive hands. Now she stood at the Emperor's side, and no one knew how to name the sight. A steward stepped forward too quickly, his face pale with shock, but the Emperor lifted one hand, and the entire line of servants went still. Not because he raised his voice, because he never needed to. His silence carried the weight of a law everyone understood. "Prepare the east chamber," he said calmly, "and send for the council." The steward bowed so fast it looked like a flinch. Mara felt the attention pressing against her skin, old and familiar, but this time it did not sting the same way. It was not contempt. It was recognition trying to catch up with truth. She lowered her gaze for 1 second, only to gather herself, then lifted it again. The Emperor noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes shifted to her with a gentleness so precise it almost hurt. "You do not need to hide here," he said, low enough that only she could hear. The words landed in her chest like a hand placed over a bruise, careful and steady. No one had ever spoken to her that way in front of witnesses. No one had ever made dignity feel so simple. As they crossed the courtyard, A child near the fountain stopped running and stared openly at the emperor, then at Mara, then back again. The child's mother tugged at his sleeve, but the emperor knelt without hesitation, bringing himself down to the child's height. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath at the sight. He asked the boy his name. He thanked him for his bow. He spoke to him like a person, not a subject. Mara watched the child's shoulders loosen as fear melted into wonder. And then she understood something she had never been taught in all her years of being overlooked. Power did not have to make the world smaller. In the right hands, it made space. By midday, the palace had changed shape around her presence. Doors opened without delay. Voices lowered without trembling. Even the hard-eyed council members who had once looked through her, as if she were made of glass, now watched her with careful attention, as if trying to understand how a woman like Mara had stood beside the emperor and not collapsed under the weight of it. But she did not collapse. She moved through the halls with her medical satchel in her hand, because that was what she knew. That was what she had always known. When an attendant cut her palm on a broken tray, Mara reached for the cloth at once and wrapped the wound before anyone else could speak. The girl blinked in surprise, then whispered a grateful thank you that sounded almost like reverence. Mara only nodded. She did not know that the emperor had been watching the entire time. He saw the instinct, the steadiness, the gentleness that rose in her before pride ever could. It changed the expression in his eyes, though he tried to keep it hidden from everyone else. Later, in the quiet of the East Chamber, he stood by the window while the sun moved over the rooftops in long gold lines. "They will ask questions," he said. Mara set down her satchel and turned toward him. "Let them," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. He looked at her then as though that answer pleased him more than anything else she could have said. "And if they bow too late?" he asked. Mara's lips parted, but before she could answer, he stepped closer and offered a small, patient smile. "Then they will still have time to learn." The room seemed to soften around that promise. Outside, the palace bells began to ring the hour, clear and bright over the city. Inside, Mara felt the strange, fragile shape of a new life begin to settle into place. Not one built on fear, not one built on hiding, one built on being seen. And for the first time, that did not feel dangerous. It felt like dawn. By the time the morning bells faded, the palace had already begun to move around Mara, as if it had finally decided she belonged in its rhythm. Servants bowed a little lower when she passed. A guard at the garden gate stepped aside before she even reached it. Small things, but they gathered in her chest like warm stones, steadying her in ways she had not expected. Yet the real change came in the East Chamber, where a stack of sealed letters waited on the table beside a tray of untouched tea. The emperor stood near the window, reading the top one with the kind of patience that made even difficult things seem manageable. When he looked up and saw her watching, the corner of his mouth shifted, almost a smile. "You can sit," he said softly. Mara hesitated only a moment before lowering herself into the chair across from him. It still felt strange to be offered rest instead of duty. Strange and dangerous in a way she was only beginning to understand. He set the letter down and folded his hands. "The council is afraid of what they do not understand," he said. "That includes me." Mara looked at him carefully. In the daylight, without the hush of the cabin or the veil of exhaustion, he seemed larger somehow, not in size, but in presence. Not demanding, just impossible to overlook. "They were afraid of me too," she said before she could stop herself. The words hung between them, honest and plain. He did not ask her to explain. He only nodded as if he had already guessed. "Then they know very little about you," he said. Her throat tightened at that, because no one in the palace had ever spoken of her that way. Not like she was a mystery worth solving. Not like she was someone whose quiet mattered. Outside, the wind moved through the courtyard trees, scattering pale leaves across the stone. The emperor turned back to the letters, then paused again, as though deciding how much truth to place into the room. "There will be a public meal tonight," he said. "Nothing grand. Only enough people to make a point." Mara lifted her eyes. "A point for whom?" His gaze held hers, calm and direct. "For everyone who has spent too long looking at the world and seeing only rank." The words settled through her like a door unlocking somewhere deep inside. He was not asking her to hide anymore. He was asking her to stand where she could be seen. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it made her breathe more easily. By noon, The palace seamstresses arrived with 2 gowns of simple cut and beautiful fabric, pale blue and silver, the kind of colors that looked like morning on water. Mara stood still while they measured her cheeks warming at the attention, but the women treated her gently, without the brittle curiosity she had expected. One of them even smiled. "The Emperor chose these himself," she whispered, as if sharing a secret too delicate for the room. Mara looked down at the cloth and felt something soft and startling move through her chest. He had thought of her before the council, before the meal, before anyone else could decide what she should be. That evening, when she entered the dining hall, the voices thinned at once. Not because she was dressed like royalty, not because she had suddenly become untouchable, but because she walked beside him with her head high and her hands steady, and the room understood that she was no longer the woman they had meant to overlook. The Emperor did not seat her at the far end. He placed her at his side, and when the first course was served, he spoke to her first, not as a display, but as if her thoughts were the only ones in the room that mattered. Slowly, the silence around them changed, not into obedience, into attention, into something more careful, more respectful, more true. Mara felt it in the way eyes softened when they met hers, in the way shoulders eased, in the way one elderly advisor lowered his gaze in quiet apology. She did not know whether he had ever meant to wound her. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that the room had begun to see her, and the Emperor had not let them look away. Later, when the meal had ended and the candles were burning low, he walked with her onto the balcony above the palace gardens. The night air was cool enough to clear the last of the day from her skin. Below them, lanterns drifted between the hedges like captured stars. He rested one hand on the stone rail and looked out over the city before speaking. "This is only the beginning," he said. Mara turned toward him, expecting the weight of more demands, more duty, more questions. Instead, he gave her a quiet, steady look that made her heart slow. "You are safe here," he said, "and when you are ready, the court will learn your name the way it should have been learned from the start." The words landed gently, but they stayed with her. Because for the first time, being known did not feel like exposure. It felt like being returned to herself. She looked out at the lanterns, at the sleeping city, at the long road ahead, and for the first time in her life, the future did not seem like something waiting to take from her. It seemed like something waiting to welcome her home. By the time the first light touched the palace roofs, Mara was already awake, sitting at the edge of the balcony with a wool blanket pulled around her shoulders and a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. Below her, the gardens were waking in slow layers, fountains murmuring, attendants crossing stone paths, the entire estate breathing as if it had finally decided to trust the morning. She had expected the new life to feel like borrowed time. Instead, it felt like work. Gentle work. Honest work. The kind that asked for patience, not perfection. Inside the East Chamber, the sealed letters from the previous night had been opened and sorted. Most were petitions from nobles asking for access, favors, or introductions that Mara did not yet know how to answer. But one letter had been set apart by the Emperor himself, and when she saw his expression as he read it, she understood at once that this was not a demand for power. It was a request for peace. An old border village had sent word that their healer was too ill to travel, and their winter stores had been delayed by the mountain roads. There was no ceremony in the message, no flattering language, only need. Mara looked at the simple seal and felt something settle inside her. This, she knew. This was the kind of problem she could touch with her own hands. So when the Emperor asked if she would go with a small escort to deliver medicine and see the village for herself, she did not hesitate. The ride took most of the morning, the carriage moving steadily over roads washed silver by frost. Mara sat beside a basket of supplies, watching the palace disappear behind the hills until only the long, white line of the walls remained. The escort was quiet, respectful, and she found that the silence no longer frightened her. It gave her room to think. By the time they reached the village, children were already peeking from behind doorways, and old men were standing in the road with cautious hope in their eyes. Their houses were simple, their chimneys thin with smoke, their square at the center lined with winter wind and worn stone. Yet when Mara stepped down from the carriage, the entire place seemed to pause. She did not arrive with gold sleeves or palace pride. She arrived with bandages, herbs, and the steady calm of someone who had learned what it meant to be overlooked and had refused to let it harden her. The healer's cottage was small and warm, and within minutes she had rolled up her sleeves and begun to work beside the village women. She listened before she spoke. She asked what each person needed. She sorted supplies with careful hands and showed a young girl how to measure dried leaves for a fever tea. When an elderly man tried to bow too deeply in gratitude, Mara caught his arm and shook her head. "Please do not," she said softly. "We are neighbors before we are anything else." The words traveled through the cottage like heat. Even the girl with the fevered cheeks looked up at her then, eyes bright with surprise, as if no one had ever spoken to them that way before. It was only later, after the medicine had been distributed and the village children had gathered near the carriage to watch the imperial escort prepare for departure, that Mara noticed the small wooden shrine at the edge of the square. It was not large, only a weather-worn carving of a dragon coiled beneath a mountain moon, but fresh flowers had been placed there, and beside them a ribbon in imperial gold. She stopped, studying it with a strange stillness. The village elder followed her gaze and lowered his voice. "Years ago, when the pass collapsed, a stranger helped us before anyone else came. We never learned his name. But after that day, the roads were restored, and our people believed the mountain itself had remembered us." Mara looked at the shrine, then at the people gathered around it, and something in her chest tightened with quiet wonder. She thought of the emperor, of his patience, his careful hands, the way he listened as if every small burden mattered. For the first time, she saw more clearly how he carried his power, not as a wall, as a bridge. When she returned to the carriage, the sky had deepened into pale afternoon blue. The village children waved until they could no longer be seen, and Mara found herself waving back, smiling before she even realized it. The road home felt different, not because the mountains had changed, but because she had. By the time the palace gates appeared again through the winter haze, she understood that healing was not only something she gave. It was something she was finally beginning to receive. And somewhere beyond the steady line of the walls, the emperor was waiting with that same quiet strength in his eyes, as if he already knew that this small journey had opened a door neither of them could close again. By the time the last lamps were lit across the palace courtyard, Mara stood at the highest balcony and watched the evening settle over the city like a soft silk veil. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain on stone and the distant sweetness of the herb gardens below. For a long moment, she said nothing. She only breathed, letting the silence rest around her without fear. It was still strange to feel at ease inside walls that had once seemed so impossible to cross. Yet now, when she looked down at the lanterns flickering one by one in the dusk, she did not feel like a woman borrowed by fortune. She felt like someone who had finally arrived where she was meant to be. Behind her, the emperor approached without hurry. He never moved like a man who needed to be noticed. He moved like someone who had already learned the value of patience. When he stood beside her, his presence warmed the cool air, steady and familiar. Mara glanced at him, and in his eyes she found the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every uncertain step of the journey. Not possession, not distance, something gentler, something lasting. He said her name softly, and she turned fully toward him. The palace lights reflected in his expression, but what she saw there was not the ruler the world feared. It was the man who had listened when she spoke, who had waited when she needed time, who had treated her pain as something worthy of care. Mara felt her throat tighten, not with sorrow now, but with the fragile ache of gratitude. She had once believed that being seen would only invite judgment. Instead, it had brought peace. It had brought healing. It had brought the kind of love that did not demand she become smaller in order to be cherished. Below them, the city moved in its evening rhythm, ordinary and alive, while above it all the sky deepened into a velvet blue pierced by the first silver stars. Mara leaned lightly against the stone railing, and for the first time, she did not brace herself for loss. She allowed herself to stay. She allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. The emperor lifted his hand, not to claim, but to offer. Mara met it with her own, their fingers joining in the quiet glow of the balcony lamps. It was such a small gesture that no one below would have seen it, yet to her it felt larger than any crown, larger than any vow spoken before a crowd. It felt like choice. It felt like home. Somewhere in the distance, a bell sounded softly, marking the hour, and the sound drifted through the cool night like a blessing. Mara looked out over the city one last time, then back at the man beside her. In his face, she saw no demand, only devotion. No shadow of the stranger she had once imagined, only the steady light of someone who had always meant to stand beside her, not above her. And as the night gathered around the palace in its calm, protective hush, she understood that the greatest miracles were never loud. They came quietly, like a hand offered in trust, like a wound that closed, like a heart learning, at last, that it was safe to open. In that stillness, with the Emperor beside her and dawn waiting somewhere beyond the stars, Mara smiled. Not because everything in life had become perfect, but because, for the first time, love had made room for both of them to be whole.